Let's see if we can come up with a better plan for this garden. So tall order. How to improve the garden in the backyard? How do we go from this to something like this? Luckily, we've already got a base plan from last week. This is kind of where we left off. Green arrows showing movement, and the orange is the existing garden beds. So I cleaned up this drawing a little bit. That way we can start to come up with new ideas in what we want to do to the backyard. To start, let's go through basically the three requirements that I have for this backyard space. The first have to do with barriers. So in this case, we have two different types of barriers. The dotted line up at the top, which means I want to be able to see through, but not perfectly. And the solid squiggly line on the right, where I don't want to see through to the neighboring property at all. The other main requirement for this garden is to have a space for the fire pit. Currently, the fire pit lives somewhere about here. It's under a spruce tree. It's not ideal in any way. So this is what I came up with on a first pass. Not really changing the shape of the pond, not really changing the shape of the grass or the amount of grass in the backyard, but you can see we've got our fire pit in the center, and basically I've just increased the size of the gardens around the ponds. The first thing on my mind when I start to design and start to shape a new garden are the perspectives. Where am I going to be looking at the garden? In this case, the main perspectives are from the kitchen window. This view has a straight shot of the pond leading to the shed. The other main viewpoint, as it is right now, is from the driveway. You have a straight shot looking straight up all the way through the grassy area and to the shed in the back. What's guiding your eye in this case is the amount of negative space in the backyard. And the negative space is just, pathways, turfed areas, things like that. The pond is another negative space. Basically anything that doesn't have plants in it, trees, or anything obscuring your view. So in this case, we have about 3 different perspectives pulling your eye depending on where you're coming from. So the main one, coming from the house, goes up and terminates in the garden bed, which is great. That's where you want your eye to be drawn. You want to see the plants and the trees and all the rest of it. The second big one, like I said, is from the driveway. And this one goes straight up and terminates at the shed. You get a little bit of viewpoint of the gardens on either side, bordering, but your eye is drawn to the shed. And the final viewpoint is more of a moving one. The main viewpoint from the deck in the backyard is of the forested area, but if you were to walk through the garden and over the bridge, you would be kind of left somewhere. Not really sure. You might see a little bit of the garden on the side, but likely your eye's going to be drawn to the garage walls or the driveway, which isn't great. That's not really all that interesting if you're moving through the garden. So I have 2 main issues with this first pass of shaping the garden. The first is about movement. It's a pretty static garden. Most of the time you're going to be looking at the garden from inside the house anyway, but that always kind of rubs me the wrong way. I want gardens to be somewhat active, enticing, and I want there to be surprise. I don't ever want a garden to be completely revealed from any one viewpoint. I want people to move, I want people to explore, I want people to discover things as they move through a space. This pass of the garden doesn't have any of that. It only really has movement going from the driveway to the shed and not really movement going over the bridge. I think I can do better than that. The other main issue that I have with this garden at this point is that the garden bed itself butts directly up against the forest edge, which is going to be a nightmare to maintain because the forest edge is going to constantly want to creep into the garden and the garden's going to want to creep into the forest. I don't want that. So let's try again. Here's my second try. You can see that the garden beds surrounding the pond are smaller. The fire pit has moved over and we have a large garden bed on the northern edge of the backyard. So right away we can see that I have a buffer between the forest and the garden beds along the side, which is mostly pre-existing right now. It's just a little 2-meter wide pathway, but I've carried that through to the fire pit as well to access the lean-to on the side of my shed. This particular layout also has a lot more interesting perspectives depending on where you are in the garden. We still have the primary viewpoint going up the pond, which in this case is a dry pond because I don't really need more space for mosquitoes to propagate, but I still want the negative space to pull the eye through the garden. The perspectives entering the fire pit from either side all terminate looking at a planted garden, as opposed to turf, the driveway, or something less interesting. Even the pathway coming from the bridge terminates at a garden edge. So there's always something visual pulling you, enticing you to move through the space. But most importantly, the viewpoint from the driveway is much narrower. It also terminates at a garden bed, but gives a little bit of a hint that the fire pit is there. Now, how did I do this? I added in more barriers. In this case, another solid barrier blocking the view of the garden, of the shed, of the backyard from the driveway, except for this tiny little piece right here. So again, I want surprise. I want to pull people through a garden. You have to give a little bit of a hint, an inkling of what's to come. And in this case, by reducing the amount of space that you can see the garden from the driveway, I've created that little bit of surprise. The last part of blocking perspectives that is important in this plan is making sure that the entire garden, or as much of the garden as possible, cannot be viewed from the house entirely. Again, I want to give a hint of the fire pit area to pull people out, but I don't want to give away the garden on the north end of the backyard from that viewpoint. So in that way, I want to, again, create a semi-barrier on that lower part of the garden. That way it sort of blocks your view when you're looking from the kitchen, but not obstructing your main sight line up the pond into the garden bed at the back. Looking at the negative space in this version, it's much more flowy. There's a general movement to it from all angles, so you can choose which path you want, which direction you want to go in. It's just much more enticing. So we again have that same viewpoint from the house that terminates at the garden bed, but we also have a loop now that goes around, that can come back to the house, that can go across the bridge if you so desire, while still maintaining access to the shed and the lean-to, to access my tools and whatever else I might need. And that's pretty much it for right now. The next step is to start picking out a wish list of plants for the garden. I'm going to work on that this coming week. But in the meantime, let me know what you think. Do you like the first version better? Do you like the second version better? Did I miss anything? Did I forget anything? Critique away.